By 2023, one of my next guests estimates that New York's Mexican community could become the city's largest Latino subgroup, surpassing Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, who have long dominated New York's Latin landscape. Where is the growth coming from? And what of Mexico's vast culture are they bringing with them? Here to show and tell us are Juan Carlos Aguirre, Executive Director of the Mexican cultural organization Mano a Mano, Mexican Culture Without Borders, and with us as well, distinguished Professor Laird Bergad, Director of the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies at CUNY's Lehman College. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Professor Bergad, tell us about your study and what you measured.
Well, one of the things that we measured was the growth of the Mexican community over the last 20 years. And we find a community that's been growing by leaps and bounds. Over 250,000 Mexicans have arrived in the city alone, over 300,000 in the metropolitan area. And not only have such large numbers of migrants arrived, but we also find an explosive birth rate among Mexican women. If we measure scientifically fertility and births, it's the highest birth rate among any actual immigrant group within the city.
How high is that? How many children per woman and compared to other groups?
Well, we measure fertility rates, and they're about twice as high as Puerto Ricans or Dominicans, so we don't do children per woman, actually. But if we combine migration and these high fertility rates and high birth rates, we find a population growth rate that, if projected into the future, will result in what you just noted, this explosive population growth whereby Mexicans will surpass Puerto Ricans and Dominicans.
And just for the viewers who are confused like me about the difference between a birth rate and a fertility rate, what is it?
Fertility rate is the number of live births per thousand population, the overall population, whereas the birth rate is the number of births per women ages 15 to 44. It's very technical and esoteric, and I'm sure not going to put a lot of people to sleep.
Are there particular push factors out of Mexico and pull factors to New York in particular?
Well, I think migration historically is to places where jobs are available, where a labor force has potential of getting employment. And we find that Mexicans, foreign-born Mexicans coming to the metropolitan area are basically between the ages of 15 and 30. That is core labor force people, and they're coming here because there are jobs available. And in fact,
in certain fields primarily?
Well, we find that because the migration is comprised of people without skill levels and with rather lower educational attainment levels, that they are disproportionately found in unskilled labor, as cooks, as laborers, much higher so than we would find if we examined the Puerto Rican labor force or the Dominican labor force. That may change in the future. But quite clearly, Mexicans, among all Latino groups, have the lowest unemployment rate and the highest workforce participation rate of any of the other Latino groups in the city.
Has it slowed in the last few years? Because there's a national stat that I've talked about a lot, that since the financial crisis started, for that reason and for some other reasons, the net inflow and outflow between Mexico and the United States as a whole is about flat, right?
Nationally speaking.
Nationally speaking. How about to New York?
The data seems to indicate that that's not the case with respect to the New York metropolitan area. We are anxiously awaiting the release of the 2012 census data, which will be coming out next month, and we'll be looking at that, and that'll give us a better idea of whether this migration has slowed or not.
And one other thing before we bring in Juan Carlos, men and women coming about equally?
Nope, there's a disequilibrium in the sex ratio of migrants. The foreign-born population is about 60% male, 40% female. What has changed dramatically with respect to gender roles in the city is the rise of households that are headed by Mexican women. In 1990, about 1 in 4 of all Mexican households were headed by women, according to the Census Bureau data that we analyzed. That's risen to about 38 to 40% by 2010.
And what does that headed by women mean? Does that mean there is no man present in the household?
Doesn't necessarily mean that no man is present in the household, but it means that the household, the head of the household, as defined by U.S. government data collecting agencies, are female.
Based on Income?
No, based on their role within the household.
Uh-huh.
This is a particular question, and it's one of the reasons why, if we look at household income, Mexicans have suffered a decline in household income when we factor in inflation between 1990 and 2010, because women are better paid in the workplace.
Juan Carlos, where are Mexican immigrants coming to New York from? A particular region of Mexico, primarily?
Well, I think Puebla is one of the biggest, and then it's followed by Oaxaca and Guerrero, and of course from many others. But those three are the.
And where are they, for people who don't know the map of Mexico?
Well, they're in central Mexico. But most people come from very small towns. They don't come from big cities.
What's the economy like in those places?
Well, it depends. Places that are predominantly indigenous are very poor, and then as you move around within the states, it changes.
So it must be a shock for people to come from a rural part of central Mexico to somewhere in the Bronx or Red Hook.
Oh, I'm sure it is. People come here, and there are many Mexicans also who don't speak Spanish or speak very little Spanish, and they're
speaking indigenous, Native American kinds of tongues?
Yes, yes. And our organization, we deal with some of those issues where there's interpretation needed for some languages, and we provide that.
What percentage of the Mexican adults here today would you say are here illegally?
That I don't know, but I might want to turn to him. But I think it's the last thing I remember. It's but this is a while back. That probably 9 out of 10. But I don't think that's the case now.
9 out of 10.
I don't think that's the case today, but it was some years ago.
From available data, it's impossible to estimate that. We analyze data, raw databases that the Census Bureau generates, and there's simply no indication of legality or whether a person is undocumented. So the official data, we know that in 2010 there were about 340,000 Mexicans counted by the Census Bureau. In the city. That may be up from about 60,000 20 years ago. That's quite an increase, but we have no clue as to how many undocumented people may be included there, or the fact that probably there is an undercount, and that the real numbers may be significantly higher.
But there are challenges for city services and city policy there, right? Because the needs of an undocumented population would be different to some degree than other populations?
Well, I think that the fundamental challenge is with respect to primary and secondary education, because the Mexican community in the city is very young. It has a median age of about 25 compared to, let's say, Puerto Ricans whose median age is 31, and Dominicans who have about the same median age, and well over 30% of the Mexican population which lives in the city today is under the age of 14 because of this high birth rate. So the challenge, one of the major challenges, is education and integrating this community into the public education system, and hopefully moving forward, graduating high school and entering universities such as our university.
How many different Mexican languages do you think are spoken here, if many don't speak Spanish?
Well, I think probably about between 8 and 10. And within those 10 languages, there are different variations. For example, Nahuatl, which is the second biggest language, has about 10 different variations. Mixteco is the one that has the largest numbers, and that probably has about 6 or 7. But it really depends where people come from.
And where do they live primarily within the city? Are there, is there Little Puebla or anything like that?
No, I like to refer to the Mexican, as everybody says Mexican community, I like to refer it as Mexican communities because we're really everywhere. We have people in Staten Island, in Brooklyn, in the Bronx, in Queens, in several areas, and also in Manhattan. So we're not in one place, we're all over the place.
And in Jersey too.
Absolutely, and in Westchester County as well.
One map that I saw seemed to indicate that a lot of the concentrations of Mexican Americans are along waterfront areas. Do you think that's accurate?
I think it's fairly eclectic. For example, in the Bronx, there are concentrations around the Kingsbridge, Pelham area, in Mott Haven, in Brooklyn, Sunset Park, in Bushwick, in Queens, in Jackson Heights, Corona. these areas in Passaic in New Jersey, which is inland. So I think there's pretty big distribution. And surprisingly, Westchester actually has a larger Mexican origin community than Manhattan or Staten Island.
Before we show some images pertaining to Day of the Dead, can you talk a little bit about the meaning of the holiday to Mexicans in Mexico or Mexicans here?
Well, I want to start just by saying that Halloween and Day of the Dead are really not related.
Not related.
Not related
Big
at all.
point.
The celebration of Day of the Dead, it's over 3,000 years old, and it's one of the oldest celebrations in this continent. And it was really in what was known as Mesoamerica, which is Mexico and Central America. And the celebration is very important, and it's a very private celebration. And it's really kind of like, when I think about it, it's like a Thanksgiving dinner. The family gets together to create an altar and to put an offering on the altar, and they welcome the dead. And all together, the living and the dead enjoy a good time.
A welcoming of the dead. Let's see some images. Talk us through these, okay? What are we looking at here?
So this is just little figures that represent musicians, and around this time, everything is represented by skeletons, and that's, I guess, why people assume Halloween and they are related.
Well, Day of the Dead, Halloween seem related in calling up those spirits. So the skeleton is an image. All right, let's go on to the next one.
So every year we honored people who have made a great influence in Mexican culture, and this is a picture of someone who was very famous in Mexico and very important to Mexicans all over to the immigrant population. So many people remember him very fondly, and we honored him, and we do paper flowers. Paper flowers are it has a great history. Paper comes from China originally, and so in Mexico, indigenous didn't have access to buy flowers because all the Spaniards, the colonists, took everything. So they created paper flowers as offerings for the dead.
And who is the guy in the picture? The look on his face almost suggests he's a comedian.
He's a comedian. His name
Yes.
is Capulina. He's very well known in Mexico.
What's he known for? What are his acts like?
His comedy is white comedy, is very innocent and very, very funny.
Let's go on to the next slide.
So these are sugar skulls, and sugar skulls in Mexico they represent death. So Mexicans believe that death is ever present, is everywhere, so it shouldn't be taken for granted. And people give this to one another during
Sugar skulls,
Sugar
are they candy?
Yes.
Edible.
Some of them are edible, the small ones.
And yet, just looking at it, it doesn't seem morose. Does it represent a certain acceptance of death?
Well, for Mexicans, death is, historically speaking, the ancients thought that death was only a step in your existence. And so that's why death is always there. And so in Mexico, death is seen as, something very sad, but also you have to rejoice because you get to see your family every year, once a year.
And Laird, do you want to chime in on this one at all?
No, thank you. Give me some numbers.
So many cultures celebrate their dead and feel that the end of this life is not the end of the existence of our spirits in one way or another.
Right.
So it's kind of in keeping with, I don't want to say universal, but a very pervasive human tendency.
Well, Day of the Dead is really a very universal celebration if you really look at it. The interesting thing is that it became a Christian celebration when the Spaniards came here. Before that, it was a 40-day celebration that happened in July and August. And they changed that to a 2-day celebration to coincide with the Catholic celebration.
Last slide.
So this is a modern thing. A lot of people are using makeup to represent skulls, to paint their faces. And this is something that is predominantly here in the United States. It's also picking up in Mexico.
Are there places people could go to celebrate Day of the Dead?
Yes, of course. They can come to our celebration of Day of the Dead. It starts on Thursday, October 31st, and it ends on Sunday, November 3rd. And we do it at St. Mark's Church in the Bowery in a very historic cemetery. That's where we do our celebration.
And are other cultures jumping in on this in any way?
Well, just recently I met a lady from Guatemala who said to me, I don't know why there's this infatuation about Mexicans and the dead. We also celebrate that. So there are other countries who celebrate it, but it's predominantly Mexico.
And Laird, to come full circle to where we started with Councilman-elect Menchaca earlier, with the growth in the population that you cited, do you think there are particular policy challenges that whoever's representing Mexican communities, which would obviously not be only the councilman from a Mexican background, should focus on?
I don't know about particular policy. I think the usual kinds of things that urban immigrants face, and I mentioned education is one, access to social services is another, access to affordable health insurance is another issues, and I think that these things will become much more acute when those large numbers of children who are born here turn 18 and thus are eligible to vote.
Well, is it appropriate to say Happy Day of the Dead?
Yes.
Then to both of you, and we will watch the rise of the Mexican population in New York. Thank you both.
Thank you.